Naturalist John Muir once said that the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. In one way, this is a story of a little family cabin tucked away inside the southern boundary of the Ocala National Forest near Umatilla. But in another, it's a more profound tale of how my father, Archie Carr, forged his own personal connection with Florida's wild places. As Daddy's insights were honed, he came to understand how animals and the places they lived were entwined in complex relationships. Through his science, his books, and his teaching, he shared his ideas about the emerging science of ecology with the rest of the world and became one of the most beloved naturalists of the 20th century. For Archie Carr, the clearest way into the universe certainly was through a forest wilderness.
It's a portal to self-reflection. It's a portal to just appreciation of the natural world. It was Archie's and the whole Carr family's portal into Florida's wildlands. That's what we're trying to preserve. It's neat that we have the cabin, its physical structure preserved. That's neat, but it's really the place, this portal that we're hoping will introduce more generations to Florida and its wildlands.
As the noted scientist E.O. Wilson once observed, Archie Carr traveled to distant lands in his career, but as a young man, he absorbed this native Eden in his bones.
Numerous times growing up, I'd accompany that field trip with a bunch of college kids, and he would hit the scrub and be chattering about the plants and animals and their relationships to each other and how they were all supported by this rather stressed, sandy environment. So, and he would do it at a kind of a dead run and was famous for that, go streaking through the forest, explaining this, that, and the other thing, and the students clinging to every word. What do you say? What do you say? What do you say?
If this little cabin represents an iconic doorway to nature, so too do the ecology field trips my father once led into the Ocala National Forest for his grad students at the University of Florida. Established in 1908, this 625 square mile forest nurtures a diverse mix of subtropical ecological systems. Bob Simons, a young forester at the time, helped Daddy lead those excursions. Today, Bob helps us better understand my father's down-home style, as well as his sharp perceptions of how ecology connected threads of nature, people, and place.
Well, here I am where I'm on a little island out in Hopkins Prairie that's been recently burned by a wildfire. During the mop-up of that fire, one of the rangers found the remains of a still, which is right here. The people that were living on Pat's Island or Hughes Island, they were poor, they had almost no money, and this was one of the very few ways they could maybe make a little bit of money was to make some illegal whiskey and sell it. There's lots of metal hoops for barrels, but there's also remains of glass jugs, the 5-gallon demijohns that they would put the whiskey in to transport it out of here.
During that era, author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings wrote about the families who endured the rugged loneliness of the big scrub here, including the fictional foresters who were notorious moonshiners.
This is a prairie that's alternately flooded like a shallow lake and dry like it is now. And when it has more water in it, it's good habitat for gators. Alligators, when it dries down, alligators like to have water, so they dig gator holes so that they can survive the drought periods. So this is probably a gator hole that's been dug over hundreds of years. Alligators have been here forever. It's part of the ecology. It's a part of the ecology of all the prairies. It's part of the ecology of the Everglades. It's part of the ecology of the Okefenokee gator holes are little deeper pockets of water that maintain life for not just alligators, but for fish and turtles and frogs and other things. So we're in the middle of Hughes Island, which is a lonely pine island in the middle of a sea of sandpine scrub.
The Ocala National Forest is bounded by the Ocklawaha and St. Johns rivers. It protects the most extensive landscape of sandpine scrub in the world.
Well, the lonely pine forest is very diverse. There are a lot of species of grasses and lilies, and there are a lot of bird species, and there are a lot of reptile species. So it's very diverse, but there are almost no endemic species. But in the scrub, which only covers, it originally covered like 1% of Florida, very small. You know, lonely pine forest covered most of the uplands of Florida, well over 50% of the uplands. The scrub is just a small thing, but it has a lot of endemics. It has maybe 50, 60 endemic species. So it doesn't have as much diversity, not as many kinds of species, but many of the species that it does have only occur in the scrub in Florida. When Florida was nothing but a few little sandy islands sticking out of the ocean, the vegetation that was here was scrub. And there's a barred owl, one of Archie's favorite. Archie Carr could imitate the barred owl. He could do better. He was a marvelous teacher. He had a real feel for other people. He really cared about other people, and other people could tell that. So everybody loved him. And he, rather than just telling people, like his students, rather than just instructing them, he would get them to help. You know, he would get them to solve he would pose the questions, rather like Socrates might pose a question, and then he would get them to solve it. He would ask a question like, you know, what kind of squirrel would you expect to have here? And 99% of the time in Florida it's a gray squirrel. 1% of the time it's a fox squirrel. Well, why? Why is a fox squirrel here and a gray squirrel over there?
Students were encouraged to think beyond a single species or a single place and consider how all of nature was linked together within the emerging new science of ecology.
And this is one of the favorite places that your father would bring his students down to just kind of stand here and contemplate the beauty of these sand boils.
These are spring boils, but they're tiny. And it becomes a challenge then, this little Jody spring, to the naturalist and to the artist. Silver Glen is providing huge benefits to the St. Johns River and to the surface waters of Florida. This little spring is not doing that much. The volume is not great, it's not so huge that it provides enormous habitat, and yet it is absolutely exquisite, maybe in the world. And so you're confronted with the challenge of why preserve it? Well, it's mainly aesthetics, isn't it? This is where maybe science and art overlap.
As Daddy once said of springs, each is a little ecological jewel in which geology and biology have created a masterwork of natural art.
You know, I'm sure Marjorie Canaan Rollins, before she even wrote her book, The Yearling, she must have come here and witnessed this little scene and said, I've got to put my boy Jody here to contemplate his own life, contemplate nature and his place in the world, and because he was raised there at the little cabin, Daddy was familiar with all these sites even before he got to the University of Florida. So he was quite an old-timer with the Ocala National Forest assets.
Yeah, he knew all these special places. He liked to talk about the plant and animal communities, but he also liked to talk about the whole landscape ecology, which this spring is a part of. Most of the Ocala National Forest is pine forest of one kind or another on deep sand, and deep sand holds a large volume of water underneath the ground that seeps out slowly and seeps into these, eventually comes back up in these springs.
So we have fossil sand dunes upslope and boiling sand down here downslope.
Yeah.
Very special place.
Very special. When we've cooled our feet down enough, eventually we'll go up and have a look at these sands where this is coming from. Well, here we are on the trail toward Pat's Island in the vast scrub of the Ocala National Forest.
Yeah, my father loved to take his students up here because he could illustrate some important points of ecology. You have the sand pine scrub here with the sand pine and the low shrubbery all around, and suddenly you get to these islands that occur here and there around the Ocala National Forest. And for some reason, you have a totally different forest community, tall pine trees and whatnot. And this contrast was mysterious and challenging and instructive in terms of a teacher and his students.
So it was one of those mysteries that your dad loved to attack mysteries.
Yeah.
There were actually people who homesteaded out here and survived using nature and pretty much in tune with nature on these two islands, on Pat's Island and Hughes Island, so he would blend that into the conversation.
Yeah, can imagine.
That's called a scrub lizard, and it's only found in the scrub in Florida. And he's not as quick as I am. Ha ha ha. And he has blue. That answers your question. The male has blue and a little rusty red under the ear. There's an ear opening. Archie would be proud of me. So Chuck, with your dad's emphasis on ecology, understanding the ecology of specific places and larger landscapes in the whole world, why is that important in the grand scheme of things to humanity as a whole?
We don't live on a bare piece of rock out here in space. We live within a biological ecosystem of our own, within which we fit, a system which we can disturb, which we can enhance, which we can exploit, but we're not alone. And so understanding what our relationship is to our surroundings is ultimately vital to our own survival on the planet. So we make wise decisions as a species, as a culture, decisions which will allow us to progress through time infinitely. You don't do that without understanding the principles of ecology.
Yeah.
You know, Bob, it's hard to imagine, but it's been 5 years and we finally got the cabin restored. It's been a lot of work by a lot of people. There have been a lot of friends of the Carr Cabin that have made it possible. We had a Master Craftsman that worked on it, Jeff Penuel, and he brought it back to life. He breathed life back into it. And we've won a lot of awards for this thing too. People couldn't get over how big a symbol this cabin was for how small a cabin it is.
A newspaper reporter who visited the cabin not long after it was restored was clearly impressed with its symbolism. The reporter wrote, "If Florida had a Walden Pond, it might be the rustic Carr Family Cabin in the Ocala National Forest."
Well, they built it right here because of the vicinity to the lake and the scrub. They love to fish, hunt ducks. Obviously, no air conditioning. They needed all the ventilation they could get.
Right.
So glass is expensive, hard to bring way out here from town. So you build screen windows, you put shutters over them, you can shut them down in the winter. You can shut them down when you leave, you get good ventilation, you stay as cool as you can in the summertime. You got the high metal roof, reflect the heat, ventilates good, and the metal lasts a lot longer than the asphalt shingles, which are hard to come by way back then. Yeah. You can see the rafters were just pine saplings that they just peeled the bark off of them. Sure, they cut them right here on site. You can see that the corner poles are all pine saplings. The floor was pine saplings. Most of these floorboards are original. We had to replace about 8 of them. And there's the original hearth and fireplace. Yeah. But they're just old regular red clay brick. But it stood here for a long time. It served its purpose, and it'll be here for a long time yet.
A place like this allows reflection. It's a place to get away. I just can't get over the fact that from this little tiny cabin out in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere, that 2 young men developed into world-class, world-famous minds and intellects. Archie Carr is admittedly the most renowned naturalist in Florida, but he's also renowned on a global scale. and his brother Tom, who is a naturalist too, but by profession. He was a pioneer in radio astronomy explorations of Jupiter. To me, it symbolizes a portal into the future for a kid. Any little knot-headed kid that comes out here and loves nature and comes here can see that no matter how humble their circumstances, they can be a world shaker too. They can go out there and they can grasp the world and they can do something. And that's, I mean, if that's not heritage, if that's not a heritage resource, I just don't know what is.
To help others walk through this portal to a larger understanding of nature, the Friends of the Carr Cabin have developed a website to introduce children and adults to the Carrs, to the vernacular restoration of the cabin, and to the rare beauty of the Ocala National Forest.
I want to keep it just like it is. In fact, my goal right now would be to extend it and make it a preserve. And not only preserve everything that was ours, but go in some of the sandpine areas surrounding and include that in the preserve too. I'd like to make the whole thing a preserve to be kept forever without devastation.
See the trail right up ahead of us? See that? Let's walk right over there.
Can they go back?
Then we can go back.
We need stories to tell our higher truths, just as we need special doorways to help us reach out and beyond the conventional and the known. I am so thankful our little family cabin in the forest still tells of a heartfelt legacy of caring and an appreciation for nature. It's a story that weaves its way through the Florida scrub, the sandhill and the springs, out into the greater fabric of the universe itself.